Hey everybody, hey, this is Will Wright. I am your political host from Faithful Politics, and welcome to the Alt-Right. I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the Georgia election debacle that's currently, occupying a lot of space in the media environment, and I wanted to, at a minimum, just kind of provide my own take on it. So I'll start first by saying, as a person who has had kind of a cult-like obsession with the Mueller probe that would, make any QAnon believer blush. I can definitely appreciate the knowingly nuanced effort of getting the facts straight before establishing, some sort of opinion or what have you. I painstakingly have read all 448 pages of the Mueller report, as well as all 5 volumes of the Senate Intelligence Report. And after reading and studying it for as long as I did, I can honestly say that I have a pretty good sense of what's going on and why Trump should no longer be in office, or be trusted with nothing more than a golf club, but even that's a little bit suspicious. So I say all this because the most recent election law, SB 202, passed in Georgia, is only 95 pages and should be mandatory reading for anyone who chooses to opine on the matter. For starters, let's get something out of the way and dispel some myths, lies, and rumors about the bill, primarily being pushed by the Biden administration and Biden himself, and noted I voted for him. So Biden in recent weeks have called the Georgia law Jim Crow in the 21st century, which of course is complete nonsense and hyperbole. First, a quick history lesson, cue Wayne's World time machine cutscene. The roots of Jim Crow laws began as early as 1865. Immediately following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which, as you probably know, abolished slavery in the United States. And clearly these Jim Crow laws were just like the state's equivalent to a temper tantrum because they can no longer depend on free labor. Boo-hoo, right? So Democrats should display some humility when it comes to African Americans and voting, since it was members of their party who opposed civil rights legislation, defended slavery in the 19th century, and promoted black codes in southern state legislatures that denied many rights to former slaves. I mean, those were actually elected Democrats who stood in schoolhouse doors denying access to black children. Democrat sheriffs who clubbed people in the streets during demonstrations and sick dogs on people, among a whole bunch of other not pleasant things. It also was the party that required poll taxes and literacy tests for blacks, violating their right to vote. Now, no one is above grace, and Democrats have come a long way to advocate for equality, #Obama, but it should not be forgotten that much of the horrendous racial history in America was promoted by the Democrat Party, which makes me wonder why so many Confederate flags end up at Republican events. I don't know, go figure. Additionally, you've also probably heard about this Georgia bill, a provision that attacks our constitutional right to be fed and watered while waiting to vote. And again, this is complete nonsense. The law prohibits the distribution of such items to avoid any perception of vote buying or illegal campaigning within 150 feet of a polling location or 25 feet of any voter standing in line. This type of activity is generally called line warming. Here's the actual excerpt from the bill. No person shall solicit votes in any manner or by any means or method, nor shall any person distribute or display any campaign material, nor shall any person give, offer to give, or participate in the giving of any money or gifts, including but not limited to food and drink, to an elector. That's found on page 71. Now, if a poll worker feels that there may be a long line and there is a concern about hydration, they are permitted to distribute water. It says this code shall not be construed to prohibit a poll officer from distributing materials as required by law, which are necessary for the purpose of instructing electors, or from making available self-service water from an unattended receptacle to an elector waiting in line to vote. That's also found on page 71. Now, I understand that voting laws are different in each state, which makes it difficult to compare apples to apples. But if you are of the mindset that Georgia is a unique situation and purely a Republican-led assault on voting rights, it's important to know that is an incorrect view of how our election system works. As a matter of fact, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, as of March 24th, Legislators have introduced 361 bills with restrictive provisions in 47 states. That's 108 more than the 253 restrictive bills tallied as of February 19th of this year, a 43% increase in a little more than a month. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm willing to bet that all 47 states mentioned are not red states. So if the Georgia election laws are, as Biden stated, Jim Crow in the 21st century, it is equally important to recognize that there are also some Democrat-ran states with similar provisions. But if you want to play partisan politics, roughly 80% of those 361 bills to restrict voting were sponsored entirely or primarily by, you guessed it, Republicans, according to a survey by 538. Now, here are a few examples of some of the similarities in Georgia states. So under SB 202, Georgia would become one of 4 states that require voters to submit a driver's license number or ID number, just like they do in Minnesota. And while they don't have a trifecta there, Democrats do have control of the House and the governor's seat in Minnesota. New York, on the other hand, does have a trifecta and has a similar provision about giving food and drinks to electors. As a matter of fact, Georgia's Republican State Senator Mike Dugan said that parts of the provision was based off of New York's election laws. So, if you are thinking to yourself, why would Georgia have to pass a bill called the Election Integrity Act of 2021 after an election in 2020 where it would appear, by all accounts, Georgia had one of the most successful elections in their state's history? Well, I've got some ideas, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But it's important that you weigh your conclusion against the backdrop of comments by the folks in charge of actually running Georgia's elections. I mean, such as Secretary of State, Chief Operating Officer, and the state's voting system implementation manager, Gabriel Sterling. You probably remember him. He stood in front of a podium with charts and what have you in response to Trump's false claim about the general election, or the big lies you probably heard. He says everybody's vote is going to count. He also said everybody's vote did count. Or how about this line from the actual Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, where he wrote in a USA Today op-ed, a record 1.3 million voters cast ballots absentee by mail here. Another 2.7 million cast ballots in person during Georgia's gold standard 3 weeks of early voting. Around 1 million waited on lines, averaging a minuscule 3 minutes on election day. By all accounts, Georgia had a wildly successful and smooth election. We finally defeated voting lines and put behind us Fulton County's now notorious reputation for disastrous elections. This should be something for Georgians to celebrate, whether their favored presidential candidate won or lost. For those wondering, mine lost. My family voted for him, donated to him, and now are being thrown under the bus by him. End quote. Now, on page 4 of SB 202, the General Assembly gives us some insight into why they are enacting this bill. They state, following the 2018 and 2020 elections, there was a significant lack of confidence in Georgia election systems, with many electors concerned about allegations of rampant voter suppression and many electors concerned about allegations of rampant voter fraud. Now, the statement doesn't necessarily reconcile with the previous statements made by the Secretary of State or his Chief Operating Officer. But to use a quote by Raheel Farouk, he's a writer and spoken word artist based in Punjab, Pakistan, he says, politics is the only art whose artists regularly disown their masterpieces. So, in conclusion, we tend to judge people by their actions, not their intent, whereas we want to be judged by our intent, not our actions. So I'm perfectly content to judge the Republican legislature on their intent. I think having integrity and fairness in elections is a noble cause, but it's difficult to see their actions being consistent with their intent, especially after they spent several months reassuring the public there is nothing to see here. Now, I'd love to know what you think about it. I'm not a Georgia resident, so if I got something wrong, please leave me a comment, and I'll try to respond. And make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and we will see you on the next ALT-Wright. Thanks so much.